In the Black Sea resort city of Sochi, Russian President Vladimir Putin delivered one of his starkest warnings yet to Ukraine. Appearing calm yet deliberate, the Russian leader signaled that Moscow might respond directly against Ukraine's own nuclear power plants if Kyiv continued, in his words, to endanger the Russian-controlled Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. At the forum, Putin leaned forward, his tone steady but sharp, and said, "This is a dangerous game. The people on the other side should also understand if they keep playing with this in such a dangerous fashion, they still have functional nuclear power plants on their side. What prevents us from responding in kind? Let them think about this, that single sentence. What prevents us from responding in kind ricocheted through international headlines within hours. It was interpreted as the clearest indication so far that the Kremlin might consider targeting Ukraine's nuclear energy sites in retaliation for what Moscow claims are Ukrainian strikes near Zaporizhzhia. The warning came amid growing tension around the Zaporizhzhia complex, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, which Russian forces have occupied since March 2022. Throughout the war, the plant has been at the center of fears of a potential radiological disaster. Both sides have repeatedly accused each other of shelling near the site, and while each denies endangering the reactors, the facility has sustained damage to auxiliary buildings, power lines, and even the surrounding towns. Putin's remarks revived concerns that the conflict, now well into its third year, might cross one of the world's most dangerous red lines. International agencies, including the International Atomic Energy Agency, have long warned that any military activity around such facilities could lead to what Director General Rafael Mariano Grossi called a nuclear safety roulette. They continue to advocate for the creation of a demilitarized protection zone around the plant, an idea endorsed by the United Nations but never fully implemented on the ground. Ukrainian officials, for their part, have consistently rejected Moscow's accusations. They argue that Russian troops have been using the plant as a military base, deploying artillery and storing equipment inside and around the complex, effectively turning it into a shield against Ukrainian strikes. Kyiv's representatives have warned that the Kremlin's talk of reciprocity is not about defense, but about intimidation, a way to deter Ukraine's Western allies and to raise the stakes in the eyes of the global public. Putin's statement was also read as a calculated move in the geopolitical chessboard of the conflict. By hinting at possible strikes on Ukraine's nuclear sites, he appeared to signal that Moscow still retains escalation tools that could rattle European capitals and test the resolve of NATO and the United States. For many in the West, it was yet another reminder that the war's dangers extend far beyond the conventional battlefield. The stakes could not be higher. Ukraine relies on 4 major nuclear power plants, Zaporizhzhia, Rivne, Khmelnytsky, and the South Ukraine facility, which together supply nearly half of the country's electricity. Any attack or prolonged shutdown would not only imperil millions of civilians living near those facilities, but also cripple the nation's energy grid, already battered by waves of Russian missile and drone strikes on power stations, transmission lines, and substations. Energy experts warn that even without a direct hit on a reactor, damage to cooling systems, spent fuel storage pools, or backup generators could set off cascading failures. Such failures might not cause a nuclear explosion, but they could lead to overheating and potentially release radioactive material into the environment. In a region that still remembers the Chernobyl disaster of 1986, these warnings are not taken lightly. The international response to Putin's statement was swift. In Brussels, European Union officials condemned what they described as reckless nuclear rhetoric. At the United Nations in New York, several Security Council members urged restraint, stressing that nuclear facilities must never become targets of war. Washington echoed those concerns, warning that even the suggestion of nuclear strikes or actions against civilian infrastructure could provoke what one State Department spokesperson called a new level of humanitarian catastrophe.
Это опасная игра, и на той стороне люди тоже должны понимать, если они будут с этим играть, вот так опасно, у них есть еще работающие электростанции атомные электростанции на их стороне. И что нам мешает отвечать зеркально? Пусть задумаются над этим.
Beyond the diplomatic protests lies the technical reality. Experts say the Zaporizhzhia plant remains vulnerable. Although it has been operating at minimal capacity for months, it still requires stable electricity and water supplies to cool its reactors. Any major disruption, whether through shelling, sabotage, or loss of power, could set off emergencies that local staff already working under occupation and extraordinary stress might struggle to contain. For Ukraine, the renewed focus on nuclear risks comes at a moment of both resilience and fatigue. Its military continues to hold large swaths of territory and carries out cross-border drone attacks on Russian infrastructure, yet it also faces relentless Russian missile barrages on its cities and power grid, while grappling with the immense costs of sustaining a war economy. Against this backdrop, Putin's Sochi statement was not merely an offhand comment, but a reminder of the conflict's capacity to threaten not just Ukraine and Russia, but the wider region. The notion of turning nuclear energy infrastructure into a front line of the conflict sends chills through Europe's energy and security planners. They worry that what began as a conventional war of tanks, drones and artillery could edge closer to a disaster with consequences far beyond the battlefields. International agencies continue to call for urgent steps to prevent such a scenario. The IAEA has appealed for unfettered access to all nuclear sites in Ukraine, insisting that transparent monitoring is crucial to avoid misunderstandings and reduce the risk of deliberate or accidental strikes. So far, these appeals have produced only limited results. Intermittent observer missions, partial staff rotations, and no binding agreement between the warring sides to keep the facilities off limits. Analysts suggest that Putin's calculated warning also serves another purpose: to keep Western leaders wary of pushing the conflict into what Moscow considers existential territory. By invoking the vulnerability of nuclear plants, the Kremlin reinforces its message that there are still levers of escalation that could make the war costlier for all parties involved. The shadow of past nuclear disasters looms large over this standoff. The Chernobyl accident of 1986, when a reactor exploded in northern Ukraine during the Soviet era, forced the evacuation of hundreds of thousands and contaminated wide areas of Europe. More recently, the Fukushima disaster of 2011 in Japan demonstrated how even peacetime mishaps can cause lasting harm to human health, agriculture, and economies. In wartime, the risk is magnified by the unpredictability of military action and the fog of conflict. For ordinary Ukrainians living near the country's other nuclear plants, the rhetoric from Sochi adds a fresh layer of anxiety to daily life, already shaped by air raid alerts and energy shortages. For people across Europe, it reinforces a sense that the war is not a distant crisis, but one that could spill across borders in the form of radiological contamination. For now, the Kremlin portrays Putin's words as a deterrent rather than a plan, a warning aimed at dissuading Kyiv from what it calls reckless provocations near Zaporizhzhia. But in conflicts marked by deep mistrust and rapid escalations, the line between warning and action can be perilously thin. As winter approaches, the fighting shows no sign of abating. Both sides continue to seek leverage on the battlefield and at the negotiating table, while civilians brace for further hardship. The statement from Sochi has added a new dimension to the crisis, one that could redraw the boundaries of the war if acted upon. The world has watched this conflict reshape Europe's security landscape for more than 3 years. Now, with the mention of nuclear power plants as potential targets, the stakes have grown even more severe. Diplomats and defense planners alike warn that the time to prevent the unthinkable is now, before rhetoric turns into irreversible action. In the end, what echoed from Sochi was more than a political threat. It was a grim reminder that modern wars, fought in densely populated and highly industrialized regions, carry risks that go far beyond conventional front lines. The future course of the war in Ukraine will depend not just on military maneuvers or foreign aid, but also on whether leaders on both sides and their international partners can step back from measures that could endanger millions of lives.